Boker Tov. Today's Daf Yomi is Yevamos Daf Chaf Gimel, Yevamos 23. Today's Daf Yomi, we're studying in memory of Grace's brother Bobby Thomas, her mother Beverly Espinosa, and her grandmother Grace. And also the whole week of Torah study is also sponsored by Jill Sachs in memory of her father, Chaim Feigelbad, Baruch Shimon V'chaya Eta. So today's Daf Yomi, we're going to start on the bottom of 22b, 10 lines, approximately 10 lines from the bottom. We're in the middle of a discussion that according to the Rabbanon, the Gemara is going to later on identify who these Rabbanon are. But according to Rabbanon, if a person marries their sister, they're going to be in violation actually of two prohibitions. Why do we care how many prohibitions? Because if they do it accidentally, then they're going to have to bring two sin offerings. And it's based upon the verse that it states, achoso, and also because also it says bas eshes avicha. So you're in violation for the fact that one verse says you're not allowed to marry your sister, the other verse says you're not allowed to marry the daughter of your father's wife. So Rabbanan say you're liable for two prohibitions, whereas Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda says you're only in violation of one prohibition. So the Gemara now asks the question, 10 lines from the bottom, for Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda, Hai bas eshes avicha mai ka'avilei. So according to Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda, what does he do with this verse that says that you're not allowed to marry the daughter of your father's wife? What is he, my avilei? What does he do with this verse? If he doesn't say it's meant to teach us two prohibitions, what's the purpose of it? So the Gemara answers that mibayale, he needs it for the following: that there is a prohibition to be with your sister if it comes from a union from whom your father is able to marry. But this comes to exclude a case of where the sister was born from a union of your father with a slave woman or with an idolatress, because such a circumstance is if the father betroths the slave woman or the idolatress, it's not actually an effective betrothal. So therefore, she's not going to be considered your sister, and so therefore there's no prohibition on marrying her as vis-a-vis your sister, but there are other prohibitions on marrying her, but just not as your sister. So Gemara says, "Ve'ema prat la'choso me'anusa." The Gemara says, "Well, why do we say that it's coming to exclude the situation where she's your sister from a slave woman or idolatress? Why don't we say it's coming to exclude the situation where she's your sister from an anusa? Anusa is a woman who your father had relations with outside of marriage. Maybe we're saying that that's not your sister to be in violation of this prohibition." Where it says, no, lo matzis amras. We don't want to say that because Rava used that verse to something else. Because the Rava threw two verses against each other. One verse states, Ervas bas bincha bas bitcha osigale. You're not allowed to marry the daughter of your son or the daughter of your daughter, which implies habas bina dida ubas bita dida shari, which implies if it's the daughter of her daughter or the daughter of her son, meaning to say that it's permitted. B'ksiv, and there's another verse which states Ervas isha uvita lo siglav. The other verse states the sister of a woman and her daughter you're not allowed to marry, which as bas b'naves bas bita, you're not allowed to marry her granddaughter from her daughter from her son. So how do we throw these two verses against each other? One verse says you're allowed to marry her granddaughter and her daughter, and the other verse says you can't. So Rava explains, if you're fully married to this woman, then you're not allowed to marry her daughter or granddaughter. But if you just had a physical relationship with her, but you're not fully married to her, then you're allowed to marry her daughter or granddaughter. So the Gemara says, but maybe that verse, Bas Bitcha, that you know how to marry the daughter of your father, maybe it's coming to exclude the following case. Maybe it's coming to exclude a girl who's born from a union which your father was prohibited to have that relationship with a woman. He was prohibited, let's say she was a mamzeres, he was prohibited to have it. And now they give birth to a child and it was a girl. Maybe it's saying that is not a prohibition to you as vis-a-vis your sister. Gemara says, no, no, that's even though she's a regular prohibition, even though there's a prohibition for your father to marry this woman, it's just a lav, it's just the lowest level of prohibition. And so therefore, the kedushin is tofes. It's considered a vow of marriage, says Rav Papa. Person will have two wives, one whom is beloved and one who is not, and one who is hated. And the Gemara asks about that. Nobody is beloved or hated before God. Means that it's a kosher marriage. Snua means it's a non-kosher marriage. So even though it's a non-kosher marriage, it's a prohibition. Nevertheless, the Torah tells us that it's a valid marriage. So therefore, it's not coming to exclude a girl who's an offspring of that union. So this says the Gemara of the Ema. Maybe it's coming to exclude prat l'chayve krisus. Maybe it's coming to exclude somebody who is with a union, the offspring of a union that you're liable for kares for. Maybe that girl is not your sister. The violation of prohibition being with your sister. Amar Rava says no. Amar Kra ervas achoscha bas avicho bas imecha moedes bayis or moedes chutz. Rava says, what does the actual verse say? You're not allowed to marry your sister, the daughter of your father, or the daughter of your mother. She's a birth of your house, or whether she's birth outside your house. Meaning to say, what does this mean? It says, Rabba Bein she'omrim lo avicha kayam, Bein she'omrim lo avicha, say whether or not the court forces the father to divorce her or not. Still, nevertheless, she is, whether or not the court forces your father to divorce her, nevertheless, you're not allowed to be with her as vis-a-vis the prohibition of your sister. So the Gemara says, and the Torah still calls her your sister, or Rabos. So, what is it coming to mean when it says achos lahi? Or Rabos achoso mishivcha v'ovodis kochavim. So the Torah, the Torah tells us that. Hold on, did I skip a line here? So Mar says right. I might have thought that whether or not your father's allowed to keep her, or whether or not. Why don't we read the verse as follows? Why don't we say whether or not you tell your father your father's allowed to remain married to this woman, whether or not he has to divorce her? Maybe it's not coming to include a kares union. Maybe it's coming to include something else. Maybe it's coming to include the case that we had excluded before, a union with a slave woman or idolatress. The Gemara says no. No, the daughter of your father's wife. The case where there is an ishus with your father, meaning to say where there is a technical speaking, like there is technically a way in which they could get married, meaning they say that they're both Jewish. So the Gemara comes to exclude a case of one sister from a slave woman or idolatress. The Gemara says Umara Isa. Why are you saying it includes the case of a shivcha and not? Why are you saying that the case of a kares union is your sister, but not the case of a shivcha or idolatress? Mara Isa, why do we do that? So the Gemara says, it's more logical to say that the case includes the case of kares, shekaim tav seba and kedushin la'alma, because somebody else could actually marry the person who you had a union that was kares with. They're like, for example, your mother, she could marry somebody else, but the other case can't marry somebody else because they're idolatrous. Gemara says, but just the opposite. Shivcha, It's just the opposite. The idolatrous offspring and the slave woman's offspring, that's what you should be including in the case of your sister. Di Megaire, Lidide, Nami, Di Megari, Lidide, Nami Tafseba Kedushin. So, because if they would convert, they'd be full Jews, and you could then marry them, and their offspring would actually fully be your sister. Mara says, yeah, that case is different because it's not the same person. When they convert, they're a completely different person. That's the phrase. When you convert, even though you're the same, you might feel like you're the same physical body. There's a spiritual transformation in your new body. So the Gemara says, the Rabbanan and the rabbis, what are they? How do they know that the offspring of a shivcha and of a slave woman and an idolatress? How do they know that such a woman, such a girl who was born from there is not considered your sister to be in violation? They learn out from the fact that a woman and her offspring should be to her master. So that means to say that they're not your sister because they belong to the master. So what does Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda do with that verse? Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda says, he says, now one of the verses, one refers to exclude a slave girl, the offspring of a slave, and the first verse is to exclude the offspring of idolatries, and this verse is to exclude the offspring of a slave. And we need both, says Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda, because if we just had the verse that if we just had the verse that the offspring of a slave belongs to her master and therefore she's not your sister, if we just said that, I would say because there's no yichus, that there's no lineage by slaves. But the idolatress, the islay where there is lineage by the idolatress, we could trace it via the mothers. I might say that she is your sister. We just have the case of the idolatress. I would say that why is her offspring not considered your sister? Because she doesn't do any mitzvos. She doesn't do any commandments. She's not Jewish. But the slave woman who herself is obligated in mitzvos, because every woman does the same mitzvos as a Jewish woman. So therefore, I might think that the offspring is not excluded from being your sister. So tzricha. So that's why you need both. The Rabbana, and according to the rabbi, and Ashkelon Shivcha, so how do we know that they exclude a slave's offspring from being your sister? Because it's the verse that the woman and her offspring shall belong to the master. But what about the idolatress? How do they know that her offspring is not your sister? How do they know that? If you want to say we're going to learn that from Shivcha, can't be. We just said, we just said you need an extra verse. It's not enough to learn from one verse. So I'm Rabbi Yochanan, so how do we know idolatrous offspring is not considered your sister? She's not Jewish. Says Rabbi Shimon Yochai. It's based upon the verse. When your son will depart from me, your son from a Jewish woman is called your son. But your son who comes from an idolatrous woman is not called your son. It's called her son. It's not called your son, but it's called her son. So Amar Avina, Shema Mina, Bam Betcha, we learn from here, the son of your daughter, if an idolater is with your granddaughter, Karoi Bincha. If an idolater is with your daughter, the offspring is called your son. It's Jewish. But if you're with an idolatress, the offspring is not Jewish. So that's what we learn from this verse. So the Gemara says, "Well, Ravina, do you want to say that Ravina is in the position that Ovik Kochavim ve'Eved Abal Bas Yisrael Avlai Kasher? You mean to say that if an idolater or a slave sleeps with a Jewish woman, it's a kosher offspring? Nihi de mamzer ohavi." So the Gemara says, "Well, granted, he's not a mamzer, but kosher nami ohavi, but still not completely kosher. Yisrael pasal mikri. They're called Yisrael with this defect, disqualification. So technically speaking, the sources talk about not marrying such a person. But Moshe Feinstein said in a similar case, today you could tell by looking at their midos that as long as they're technically Jewish, you can tell by looking at their midos whether or not it's a good person worthy for you to marry. See how they act, see how they behave. So the Gemara says, yeah, but wait, there's a problem. That verse, Ki Asiris bin Chamei Acharai, that's referring to the 7 Canaanite nations, not referring to every idolatress. Hi b'shiva umos ksiv. That's only written by the 7 nations. The Gemara says Ki Asir. When it says Ki Asir, Rabos kol masirim, it's referring to taking away any. It's referring to say that anyone who will lead your child astray, their offspring of their women are not Jewish. Where it says, "Well, honey, Rabbi Shimon the Darish time in the car." That only makes sense according to Rabbi Shimon, because he expounds the meaning behind the verses, and he says it doesn't only apply to that case. We can understand the meaning behind it and apply it broader. But what about the Rabbanon? The Rabbanon are the one who need this extra verse, and you're saying they can't use Ki Yasir because it only applies to 7 nations. No, the Rabbanon here are Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon, in this circumstance, Rabbi Shimon are the Rabbanon, and so therefore it works out nicely. So the Gemara says we're on top of 23b. The Gemara says as follows. Now we have the Mishnah, a new Mishnah. In this case, what's the Mishnah referring to? The Mishnah is referring to a case where, as a background, we know that if there's a woman who falls to Yibum or Chalitza, she's not allowed to get married to anybody in the market unless she first has Yibum or Chalitza. Secondly, we know a background law that a man is not allowed to marry his wife's sister, even if he divorces his wife, because you're not allowed to be married to your wife's sister unless your wife dies. But so even if he divorces her, it's still a biblical prohibition. But if she gets chalitza, your wife, if a woman who you did chalitza with, well, then rabbinically you're prohibited to marry your sister, because chalitza is like divorce. It's rabbinically we're going to say it's like divorce. And then last thing is that if you have a zika with a woman, means she falls to yibum with you, then you can't do yibum with her if you're married to her sister, because then it's like you're married to her, so you can't marry her sister. You can't marry your sister until you've done chalitza. And you can't marry your sister at that point because it's like you are married to her because you have the zika. And zika is like a quasi-marriage. Rabbinically, we're going to say that. So now that's the background that you need for this Mishnah, which bear with me. And if you apply yourself to it, you won't have a problem with it. But the first couple of times I read it was slightly confusing, but now I think I'm getting the hang of it. So Misha Kidesh Achas Mishtei Achayot. So somebody comes along, let's go on Ruvain, and he betroths 2 sisters, Rachel and Leah. But for whatever reason, Ein Yodea Ezem and Kidesh. She doesn't know which one he betrothed. Maybe he did it through an agent, and therefore, since he did it through an agent, the agent got confused. Whatever reason, he betrothed them, he doesn't know which one he betrothed. So each one is potentially married. So therefore, noticing get lazu, he has to end up giving both of them a divorce, so that otherwise they'll be stuck and they can't marry, and they can't marry anybody else. And since they're 2 sisters, he's not allowed to be with them ever again. Or maybe when one of them dies, he can marry the other one. But in the meantime, he has to give both of them a divorce. Meis v'lo ach echad. Let's say this Reuven dies, and he has one brother. His name is Shimon. So Shimon has to do chalitza shteim. Shimon has to do chalitza with them, because we're saying that chalitza is like a divorce rabbinically, and so therefore he has to make sure that both of them, he doesn't know which one can go into the marketplace, so therefore he has to do the chalitza with both of them, so that both of them can marry anybody else that he wanted. Let's say this brother who died, Reuven, has 2 brothers, not just Shimon, but Shimon and Levi. So then we say under those circumstances, echad choletz v'echad miyavim. The first one does chalitza, and now that he's done chalitza, the second brother could come along and do yibum. Why? Because if the sister, because if this woman he did yibum to was his akuka, he did chalitza with her, and so therefore, since he did chalitza with her, he did chalitza with both of them, and so therefore, since he does chalitza with one of them, so that if that woman was his really is Yevama, well, now she's released, and the other one was nothing. But if she was not his chalutza, if she was not the one who his first brother had married, well, then the other brother is now doing yibum with his wife, and it's perfectly acceptable because the other sister was never married. So that's that case. Kadmu v'kansu. Let's say these two brothers went ahead and they married both of these women, these sisters, before the courts told them not to. So then, we don't force them to get divorced. Why not? Because we could say that the first one who did yibum with her, and then the second one did yibum, he uprooted any connection. Look at what Rashi says. Rashi says the kol chad v'chad. Each one is saying, "I married properly." And if you would even say that actually the first one who did yibum was actually marrying the sister of the zakuka, meaning the sister of the woman who he was supposed to do yibum with, and so therefore he really wasn't supposed to marry her. It's true. At that moment, he was prohibited. However, when the brother comes along, when his second brother comes along and does yibum with the other one, it uproots the zika connection retroactively. And so then each one is married to a person. One of them would have been the Yevama of his brother, but the other one was not at all connected. And you can marry such a person. Okay, so now we're up to the next case. So now it wasn't one who betrothed two sisters, it was two separate men. Let's call them Reuven and Gershon. They're not necessarily brothers. They're not brothers. Then they betrothed two sisters. Each one does not know which woman he betrothed. So no saying no saying. So each one has to give two divorces. So let's say they ended up dying. And each one has their own brother. Again, we say the same principle. It's the same exact concept. Each one has to divorce both women. But let's say one of them has one brother and the other one has two brothers. So the one who has the single brother, he has to do the chalitza to both of them because he does not know which was his brother's wife, who he's supposed to do yibum chalitza with, and the other one is a sister, so he doesn't know which one. So he can't marry the sister of the woman he's supposed to be marrying, or the sister of the woman he's supposed to give chalitza to. So the first brother comes along and does chalitza to both. And then, what happens is, Vashnaim and the two remaining brothers, Echad chalitza, the first one does chalitza, but then the second one, Echad miyabim, but the second one there, he's already allowed to do yibum because he could say, if you were not the wife, then my brother already did. If you were the wife, my brother already did chalitza, and therefore I can marry the other woman. But if you're not the wife, then I could do yibum with her. No problem. But now, can't move a kintil, and it's the same idea. Let's say they went out and married. The last two brothers went out and married these two sisters. And we don't force them to do a divorce. Let's say each one has two brothers. Well, then what do we do? Then the brother of this one, the brother of one of them does chalitza with one. So the first one can do chalitza with one of them, and the second one can do chalitza with one of them. And then then each one could do yibum with the other one because they've been released at that point. And so therefore, since they've been released, and when the second one does yibum, he uproots any zika. And so basically that would be okay. Kadmu shnayim, let's say they both did yibum v'choltzu. Let's say the first two came along and did chalitza. Lo yimu hashnayim. Then the second two cannot do yibum. Rather, ela echad cholitz echad miyabim. First one does chalitza, and the second one could do yibum, like the case above. And kadmu v'kansu emotziim biyadam. And if they went out and married them, same principle. We don't force them to get divorced. So the Gemara says, Shema Mina, we learn from this case the following concept. We learn Kedushin She'ein Misura Mabia Havi Kedushin. The Gemara assumes at the beginning, Rashi says that it was a case where a person says to the two women, I'm betrothing one of you, I'm just not sure which one. Well, I guess he just wants to make it complicated. So he says that. The Gemara assumes, meaning to say he doesn't know from the outset. He says, I'm betrothed to one of you, and then both of them made an agent to accept it, and he doesn't know which one got it in the end. So in that circumstance, he's never allowed the kedushin. He was never able to be intimate with either one. So if that's the case, under those circumstances, that's a kedushin that we say she'ein mesur l'bia. They can never act upon it, and the Gemara assumes that it's still a valid betrothal. We don't want to say that because that's a dispute throughout the Talmud. So therefore, the Gemara says, no, actually, that's not what's going on. No, the brother knew about them at the beginning. He knew which one it was known at the beginning who was able to be his betrothed, but then it got confused. It was often this arvo, like he sent the agent, and the agent forgot which one he betrothed, and so that's what happened there. And it's not that it was never known; it was known, but then it was confused. And Dekanami Dekatani V'Eino Yodea does not say Lo Katani V'Eino Yodu. It says he does not know. It does not state it is not known. Shema Mina. Mar says, "Oh, Micah Mashmoan." Well, if that's the case, what's it coming to teach us? Mar says, "Seifa Tzricho." It needs to teach us the next cause. Because what's the next cause? It states Meis V'Lo Ach Echad. If he dies and he has one brother. Echad of Meis V'Lo Ach. So he needs it. It says if he dies and he has one brother, Cholitz L'Shteim. Then he does this. One brother does chalitza to both of them. If he has two brothers left, echad chalitz v'echad miyabim. One could does chalitza, and the second would do yibam. So, and it's teaching us dafka milchatz v'adar yevumi that first you have to do chalitza and then yibam. But you can't start off with yibam. Why? Because it's possible that's really the sister of the woman who needs yibam, and then the kapaga ba'achos ukukasa. You're not allowed to marry the sister of the woman who you have a zika with. So that's what's teaching us the case that you first do chalitza and then yibum. Says the next case, Shnaim shekadshu shtei achayos. If you have two sisters, and we said there under those circumstances that and each one doesn't know which one he betrothed. Then the first one gives two divorces, and the second one gives two divorces. Okay. Shema Mina Kedushin She'ein Mesur L'Bia. The Kedushin, the same idea. The Gemara assumes at the outset that it was impossible to ever know, and it's still a valid betrothal. The Gemara says no. Here too, they knew about it, and then they got mixed up. And Dekanami the Ketani Ein Yudea, Lo Ketani Ve'Ein Yudu. It doesn't say it was not known. It says he does not know. Shema Mina My Kamash. So what's it teaching us here? The Gemara says. It's again, we need it for the next clause, which states that if the brothers die and one brother has one surviving brother, the other one has two. The first brother's single brother betrothed does chalitza with both of them. The second one does chalitza, one does yibam. Again, pshita. That's exact same clause as the reisha. You might have thought that we're not going to allow it, the two brothers, we're not going to allow them one to do yibum there because in the first case he can only do chalitza. Okay, so it's the same idea. So all right, we'll stop here. God willing, pick this up tomorrow morning.